Thank you so much for anticipating. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our expert panel, co-hosted by the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and the National Policy Network. My name is Julianne McCall. I am the Director of Programs and Events for JSPG. As a volunteer for the volunteer-run journal. My day job is as co-director of precision medicine at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I'm absolutely delighted to bring this group together for what's undoubtedly going to be an inspiring conversation with an opportunity for our audience to pitch questions to our esteemed panel of experts. So please start thinking about any questions you'd like to contribute, and we'd be glad to consider them in the chat. And without further ado, I wanted to provide an introduction to the National Science Policy Network. They are a young organization, the mission of which is to catalyze the engagement of early career scientists and engineers in the policy world by fostering an inclusive community, training new generations of diverse leaders, and empowering advocates for the role of science in society. In a future slide, I'll show a few of the many programs that they offer for free for early career researchers and engineers. Quickly about the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, we're an internationally recognized open access peer-reviewed research publication. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We like to think of ourselves as a vehicle for students and early career scholars to publish articles concerning every corner of science and technology policy, and then further using the platform to bolster research and writing credentials in, again, science and technology policy. We encourage folks to engage with us and contribute to the policymaking process at all levels of government. In order to bolster up those skill sets, we, alongside National Science Policy Network, are providing webinars similar to this one, writing workshops, and other panel opportunities, in addition to career development programs such as certificate programs, where we have in the past partnered with universities and graduate schools. We are regularly soliciting candidates applications to join our editorial board, and we are facilitating internship and mentorship programs. So please feel free to go to our websites. I'll place the links in the chat momentarily. We also like to highlight published work beyond the potentially passive platform of our online journal through presentations with partners, conference panels. We've recently relaunched a podcast series and are connecting with media in many different ways. We recognize that those of us who've lived within this bridge world of science and technology policy recognize that science and technology don't necessarily speak for themselves, that you need the active, proactive application into the policy world, and we're delighted to support those efforts. So getting into the current submission, the deadline is fast upcoming, less than 2 months away, on November 6th, where we are soliciting every format that the journal supports, including policy briefs, policy memos, op-eds, and others. So please do go to our website. Again, I'll place it in the chat in a moment to learn more about all the different ways that you can pitch your ideas and comment on various issues and generally contribute. So I'm delighted to now get into the highlight of today's event, our distinguished expert panel. Like I mentioned before, we'll spend the second half of today's panel in more of an interactive form, where we'll encourage questions and comments from the audience in order to better tailor discussion to what you all are interested. I think you're all well familiar that there are graduate programs that span years introducing such ideas that we're going to be touching on today. So we're going to be maintaining a relatively high level, and again, glad to know where you, the audience, would like to take this panel. So I will, I'm now delighted to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order by last name. So I'll start with Aaron Hamlin, who serves as Executive Director of the Center for Election Science, as well as a co-founder of the organization. He's been featured as an electoral systems expert on numerous television media channels, as well as in written form on various journals and magazines. His specialty is in voting methods. He just commented before we began here that he's currently focusing on the recent Alaska elections, and with midterms right around the corner here in the United States, you can imagine he's quite busy. He's a licensed attorney with 2 additional graduate degrees, both in the social sciences, and we're delighted to have him. Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm going to now head over to our second panelist, Dr. Jane Anna Mante. She goes by pronouns she, they, and serves as Director of Narrative, Arts, and Cultural Strategies at Race Forward, where she works with her colleagues to advance a vision of just, multiracial, and a democratic society free from oppression and exploitation, in which people of color thrive with power and purpose. She was formerly working at the California Department of Recycling, the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, the Sierra Club, and Ceres. She's also an educator, having taught courses on biology and medical humanities, and is a very proud 2-time HBCU alumni, currently based in Houston, Texas. Thank you so much for being here, Jane. Dr. Anna Reed works at the Natural Resources Defense Council, based in their San Francisco office, working at the intersection of science and policy to reduce and eliminate harmful exposures to toxic chemicals for the safety of people and the environment. She serves as lead scientist on Pfas, a chemical that she'll introduce to you in further detail, within which she conducts research and develops innovative scientific tools on top of her role guiding NRDC's Pfas policy work. I'm really thrilled for you all to hear an amazing success story of that has just recently taken the world by storm. She was recently a Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the California State Senate, and has her PhD in developmental biology from University of California, San Francisco. Thank you so much, Anna, for being here. Now, I would love to invite the panelists to spend about 5 minutes each, providing a brief overview of your roles and perspectives, including where you fit into the policymaking machinery and how your background, including your academic experience, your life experiences, how they all shape your work. So, Aaron, I'm going to hand it to you, and perhaps we can go in the same order.
Great, thank you. So as you mentioned, I am the Executive Director for the Center for Election Science. We study voting methods, as well as advocate for better ones. And when we say voting method, what we mean is the information you put on your ballot and how that's calculated. Like normally when you go to vote, your ballot gives you some candidates, it tells you to choose one, and then you just add them up, most of its wins. But there are a bunch of ways to do that. You can provide ranking information, you can pick all the candidates that you like, you can score candidates, and there's different ways of adding up that information. And that's really what we're looking at, because it's important to make sure that we elect good people to office, and to make sure that happens, it's important to look at the mechanism that does that. And so that's what we focus on, as well as advocating for better ones. In terms of the policy component, we have been involved in a little bit of lobbying, but before we came around and had funding, which is like within the last 5 years, this voting method that we advocate for, which is a just saying you can pick all you like in terms of candidates. It's called approval voting. Before we really advocated for it, it wasn't implemented anywhere. But we got it working with partners in local communities. We were able to get it implemented in 2 cities. And the way that we do that in terms of policy is through ballot initiatives. So what we do is we work with these local groups. We provide a grant for them once they're at the sophisticated level to be able to run a campaign. And then with that grant, like they're able to collect signatures. Once they get enough signatures, they can put this initiative on the ballot. And if enough people say yes, more than half, then now they're using approval voting, this pick all you like approach for their local elections. And in terms of background, as mentioned before, my background is in the social sciences and law. And so I think it helps to be able to look at problems in a very fundamental way and ask fundamental questions, which in some cases are like not always historically asked. So like, and when I mean that, I mean like very basic questions like what makes a voting method good? And so when we think about questions like that, we think about like, okay, well, you got winner selection, accuracy of candidate support, how straightforward or complicated the voting method is to understand. And then when we're asking these basic questions, we of course also ask, well, how do you measure that? And can you do it in a falsifiable way? And the way that we've worked on that, trying to be more innovative, oddly within voting methods, there hasn't been control measures in the past. And so one of the research designs that I designed for our article looking at the 2016 election, for example, which we've replicated in other scenarios, is asking respondents how they honestly feel about the candidates, like on a scale of 0 to 5 in terms of wanting them to be elected. And having that measure, contrasting it with the actual voting method measure, to see how accurately these voting methods are at capturing candidate support. And so we do this as well as other approaches when we're evaluating different voting methods in actual scenarios. And of course, we can use actual ballot data as well, which we're interested in doing with the current Alaskan election. So that's a bit about our work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that high-level overview. We're excited to dive into some of those details. Dr. Mante, would you like to provide the same type of overview? Thank you. I don't know if it's me, Jane. It looks like you are still muted.
I'm muted. Oh, no.
No problem.
Rookie move. Hey everybody. I'll try this again. Hey everybody. Jane Mante. Glad to be here with y'all today. You know, when I think about, you know, where I'm situated within like the policymaking ecosystem and what even brought me to this space, you know, I really think about, you know, the local being political, like local politics is what drives us. And for me, you know, growing up, you know, I was very interested in community health, you know, environmental health, why the neighborhoods in which I lived in, where I walked around or went to school, why they looked certain kinds of ways compared to other, you know, parts of where I grew up, why, you know, my family, you know, my neighbors' families, why we had certain types of you know, conditions, whether it be cancer, obesity. What I learned later on were like health disparities, you know, where does all come from? And I was very interested in that growing up. And it led me, you know, to at first think I'd become a physician, you know, become an MD, and that was no, not for me. And so ended up in research because I really love the idea of being able to ask questions and then for a living, find those answers, right? And over the course of, you know, doing the whole spiel of grad school and everything else, I, you know, really got into student government, really got into community organizing and trying to address some of these local issues that seem to crop up wherever I moved to for college and or grad school, right? There were always these local questions that needed to be tackled. And it led me to the world of science policy. And so to be more brief, you know, I've occupied various, you know, stations within the like political ecosystem. I have worked in California state government. right? As alleged aid, actually supporting a politician to like enact their vision and the vision of their, their communities they represent. I've worked, for nonprofits much more on the outside. I wouldn't say I was a lobbyist. I wasn't, registered as that, but supporting lobbying in various kinds of ways, supporting advocacy for issues, right? That, we all see, whether through our research or just, by our experience, how we're living. And then now in this current, phase of my career, I've actually transitioned to a different, vantage point, right, of policymaking. I work now on narrative. And narrative, is getting very buzzwordy right now, but it's a niche and growing space that's thinking about how we even conceptualize society, right? What are the kinds of values that we have, and how does that then drive the kinds of policies that we pursue, the kinds of business practices, the kinds of regulations that we have. And I think within the STEM world, folks might hear values and how we view the world and think it's very soft and squishy, particularly if you're like within the hard sciences. But actually, we too are driven by society's values, society's norms, and that informs how we understand even our own data, right? And so as someone who operates within science policy, it's really important to like think about the kinds of narratives that we are advancing through our science policy work, through our data science, right? These are all very important things that are interconnected. And so I work with various organizations when they are thinking about science advocacy and science policy, about, what is it they're trying to actually communicate with society? What kind of, new kind of world, new kind of being, new kind of activity do you want folks to understand, but also to accept, right? Because we can change policy all day long, but if folks, don't think it's fair or don't understand it or they're afraid of it, it's very hard for them to actually like acclimate and comply, right? Thinking about folks who are in medicine, compliance, right? It's very hard for folks to comply if they don't understand and don't believe in what you're trying to get them to move towards. So I work with various organizations to figure out the kinds of narratives they want to spread so that folks can understand the kind of policy changes that we're trying to call for and hoping to achieve. So yeah, a variety of areas. And I hope I can share more about those various areas because we need scientists and folks with advanced degrees in all those spaces. So I'll pass it from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mante. Dr. Reed.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about that in a bit. So my name's Anna Reed, and where I fit in the policy making machinery, I would say that I'm an advocate, which it doesn't fit into one spot actually. So generally, you could say I'm part of the third house, as we call it, a lobbyist. But that's not quite how we work. So I work for the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a large environmental and public health nonprofit. But I work specifically within the Health and Food Division on toxic chemicals. And the nice thing about the work that we do, it's very goal oriented. So it's all about reducing people's exposures to toxic chemicals, and really in any way we can do that. So instead of fitting into one specific lane and just say I'm a lobbyist, I'm only going to work with bills in Congress or work at the state level with and try to move policies forward and specifically in one lane, we say, well, how are we going to achieve our goal? Reducing people's exposures to toxic chemicals. Unfortunately, there's thousands of chemicals that are of concern. So how do we whittle down our very limited resources? We're a pretty small team. And so we kind of look at where are the biggest threats to people's health from pollution, and then try to look for the intersection of where our strengths are. We're a small team of lawyers and scientists, and then try to work on those problems. So what I work on are Pfas chemicals. They're highly fluorinated chemicals that are used for making Teflon and Scotchgard, and they're super durable. They don't go away. They don't degrade in the environment, so that's why they're called lovingly forever chemicals. That's how most people know about them, and they're associated with a whole host of health effects that are very concerning. So how do we tackle this problem? Well, I think that one of the things that we look at is where are the avenues that actually can move forward. So, a few years ago, we couldn't do much at the federal level. So we did a lot of work at the state and local level. And we also do a lot of work with markets, with businesses. So that's when I say I'm an advocate, not necessarily a lobbyist, because I've done a lot of work pushing, businesses to make the right decisions, to be better stewards of our health and our environment by moving away from PFAS use in their products, but at the same time also worked on ban bills where we think California says we no longer allowed to use PFAS chemicals in our food packaging, right? Because that's a direct exposure to people of these chemicals. So I would say that I fit within the policy making machinery where it's needed and where we can best move policies forward that will help protect people's health.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you all three for also helping to develop a foundation of kind of an introductory understanding of how the public policy making process proceeds from ideas to action and hopefully policy change. So in this next half of our panel, I would love for the panelists to a chat among yourselves with the public audience of the various strategies that you've applied that were more effective than others, right? Kind of a kind of the science of advocacy, right? How do you actually do this effectively? Everybody has such limited time. We recognize that data don't speak for themselves, right? That you need this established network, platforms, and relationships, right, to bring decision makers into understanding why these issues should be prioritized over the countless other priorities that politicians and other decision makers are faced with on a daily basis. So we don't necessarily need to go in order. I know all three of you have numerous and wild successes to be able to share with our group as recently as just within the last month. Do I have a volunteer who might be able to start us off?
I don't mind going.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
And I'll share one, and it's not a science policy example, but I think it's really informative, particularly for this audience, because it surprised you, it surprised me, and I'm hoping it surprised y'all as to the ways in which you can influence policy, whether it be science policy or other kinds of policies. So a number of years ago now, I worked on a bill in the California State Legislature on child support arrears, right? And I hope already, this infers how not sexy of a bill it was that was given to work on. And what child support arrears are, for folks who, may be co-parenting a child or themselves, have parents who were separated or not married, someone has to pay child support. And when you are incarcerated, right, you don't have a job usually, or a job that pays you a lot of money, and your child support bills can't add up. They can go into arrears. And what we're seeing within California, particularly at the county level, were folks who would be released from jail or prison with really, really high back bills of child support that it was debt they could not surmount. You just could not come back from that. And so for a moment, counties were given the ability to freeze people's child support. But because of the stigma towards folks who are incarcerated, right, for things they may have done or not have done, or just the view of folks who are imprisoned, there were a lot of stipulations put in place, making it actually pretty hard for counties to actually use this power to freeze child support. You had to go to like a court to do it. And even though, you might have known as a caseworker, you couldn't do it yourself. And so it wasn't a very effective program, but for the folks who actually did get their child support frozen, it was, life-changing, right? They served their time, they got rehabilitated, or, they were found to be not guilty and got out, and were able to, join society, find a job, or, reclaim their job and pay the child support. But for many other people, they couldn't do that. And I chose this example to talk about because it highlighted a number of things for me as someone early in my career in policy wholesale, right? This bill had a very unique set of supporters. There were folks who are supporting, who are, trying to help people who are incarcerated and their families, trying to, say, hey, they don't make a lot of money. So everyday people who either themselves have been incarcerated or have family incarcerated or are very concerned about the criminal justice system. We had, folks from the county, various counties who, very much, suit wearing people who, were not, folks who were necessarily not tough on crime, but saw this was not a very effective system. And then on the opposing side, we had, both we had, I think the courts were there as well as the prisons, so corrections. And they were like, whoa, what are y'all trying to do? What are you doing here? Too much change. And it was just very interesting, right, to see this very, usually opposing groups, county workers, working, among the courts, working, amongst even jails, and folks who are battling against, prisons and police coming together to say, hey, we can actually provide a much better service that does not let folks who have done crimes off the hook, but at least understands, that, we're human and you're not able to pay this debt if you have no job. It doesn't make sense, right? And also too, an argument they put forth, it also is a public health matter. Because these folks, if they come out of, jail or prison with high amounts of debt, and they're already facing a lot of barriers re-entering society, having this high amount of debt can actually impact them negatively. They can't maintain, work. They can't maintain, a place to stay. They're always at risk because of this debt of being reincarcerated, because not paying child support is a crime, right? And many of them actually were going back to prison, negatively impacting their health outcomes, but also the health outcomes of their children, right? Trying to remend families makes it a little hard if you keep going to prison because of, outstanding debt that we know you could never pay back. And so, so honestly, I would say as my time in the ledge, this actually was the very first bill that I got, all the way through from an idea to the governor's desk, because we saw a confluence of varied interests saying this has to happen. We have to find a way to administratively, if we know someone's going to prison, just freeze their debt, right? That way when they come out, they can pick it back up again and, pay their dues. And so to be very brief, the thing that I want y'all to take from this here, one, local politics matter, right? The state was very much like, we shouldn't do this, but county folks, county workers, which could be you all one day. Y'all could be county scientists, you could be local scientists doing local-based, science policy work, came out and like, no, this actually, we can do better than this. And they pushed hard, and they gave legitimacy to the voices of folks in the grassroots who were like, folks are coming out of prison with high debt they can't pay back. And so both, even as a community member, if you're seeing that folks are struggling, you can raise your own voice with folks in community. As a public employee at the local or even state level, you can also raise your voice, and that will be informative. And having those two things, when corrections, the state correctional agency came forward and said, hey, we're opposed to this. We said, look at these supporters. We have public employees at the county level saying this has to happen, professionals, and you also have folks who are just, community members, residents saying that this is impacting folks, maybe them, maybe folks they care about. And together that was enough to, thwart any kind of opposition, right? And it just speaks to the power that local politics can have in even shifting state politics. And so folks should not lose sight of that. And even if you don't choose a career in science policy, you can still, as an everyday citizen, work with your neighbors, work in local government to change things that are happening within your state. It happens every day. It can happen, tomorrow too.
Fantastic, Jane. Thank you so much. Right, I heard so many different themes that you touched on. Right, crucial to the science and technology public policy making. Right, the multi-generational impacts. Right, the intersectionality of policy. Right, incarceration policy, how its effects on health are so powerful. Right, the externalities, right, the need for coalition building, bringing folks from various parts of the community together for one solid systems change proposal. And then, of course, the local communities' power to actually affect change by communicating with other and partnering with other levels of government. Thank you so much for that brilliant example. Erin or Anna, would you like to chime in with examples of your own? And then thank you from the audience for the questions coming into the chat already. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to taking those questions after this handful of examples from the panelists.
I can go next, especially since I see a question that I think I could probably answer as I talk about an example of what I've done. So as I said before, I work on Pfas chemicals, and I'll just give a little history it helps with kind of explaining this example. So originally there were only a few chemicals that would fall under this class. They were used to make Teflon by DuPont and Scotchgard by 3M, and it was billed as this amazing new advancement for like our convenience of living, right? Like who doesn't love a nonstick pan or a carpet that you could spill red wine on and not have to worry about a stain? It was billed as miraculous chemistry, and it is very miraculous chemistry. There's really nothing quite like these chemicals. Basically what they are organic chemicals that have been fluorinated, and that carbon-fluorine bond doesn't exist naturally in the environment, so this is a man-made chemical that is just incredibly strong. Those bonds are not easily broken. We're talking about over 1,000 degrees centigrade for long periods of time before you can break that bond. And so, everything was great for a while, but then the chemical company started to realize that they were finding these chemicals in their workers' blood, and then they tried to go find a control sample to compare, the levels in the workers' blood to, people who didn't have PFAS in their blood, and they found out they couldn't find one. So, decades of use, and all of a sudden they're starting to realize everybody's being exposed to these chemicals. They're getting into people's blood, and then animal studies started to show that there were some serious health effects associated with them. Everything from liver and kidney damage, cancer, reproductive and developmental effects, a whole host of very concerning effects from being exposed to these chemicals. And once they're produced and released into our environment, they don't go away. So they've been building up and building up. And so once people started to catch up to the problem, so unfortunately, this wasn't shared by the companies to the EPA or anybody else for decades. And so once the scientific community started to realize what was going on, became very concerned, there was a lot of pressure, right, to change the situation, to fix this problem. And so the chemical company said, we will move away from these chemicals. And they quickly moved into sister chemicals. So, so you have PFOA is the most famous of these chemicals. It's an 8-carbon version. And they went to 6-carbon versions and 5-carbon versions and 4-carbon versions. And they said, we have moved away from PFOA. Don't worry. The next group that we're working on is totally safe. And so what happened was what we term in the toxic world is regrettable substitution. So going from spending all this effort, scientific effort to define the problem, prove enough, provide enough evidence to policymakers to do something. And then it takes years to do that. And then it takes years to do that something, to regulate a chemical. I would say that 10 years is a very optimistic estimate of what it takes to regulate a chemical once you've shown that it needs to be regulated. And what the chemical industry does is simply just add a group here, a bond there, change the structure just a little bit, and it still gives them just the same function that they need for what they're doing industrially, and unfortunately likely causes the same health effects, right? There's not much of a change. And so what happened was we went from a few PFAS chemicals being produced and released into our environment to we have an estimated over 12,000 PFAS chemicals in the class now. So the industry can easily switch from one chemical to the next to do what they need to do, and there's no way scientists can keep up, and there's no way regulators can keep up. And so what I'm going to talk about is where there's a problem. Everybody knew the problem. All the scientists, community members, policymakers recognize that the regrettable substitution is a problem and that PFAS chemicals in general are a problem. But how do we go about tackling that? And a group of scientists, both from NGOs, from the EPA, from academic institutions, got together and wrote a paper. Which is, interesting way to start, but it's nice to sometimes where you can have scientists get together and try and lay the foundation for a solution that can be brought into policy. And so we wrote about what we call the scientific basis for regulating PFAS as a class. Like, why would we treat all of these chemicals the same? Why would we manage them the same? And it's because, one, they don't degrade. So anything that we put in the environment that doesn't go away, there's like no way to reverse our actions is of concern, right? Like if it takes you 20 years to realize it's a bad chemical, then you can't do anything about it. That's not a good idea, right? So that was kind of the foundation of that. But there's a lot of other reasons it builds up in people's bodies. It's very mobile. So like if you produce it at a plant, it will go 20 miles in the air and deposit down into the ground and then affect people's groundwater far away, right? We find it in the Arctic, we find it everywhere. So it's very mobile. You can't control it once you release it. And then, of course, the PFAS that we have studied, we obviously have not studied thousands of chemicals, but we have studied, a good sampling of PFAS, and all of them have come up with health effects linked to them, right? So it's not a good trend. So we lay out the foundation, like the scientific basis for why we need to manage PFAS as a class, and then we urge, policymakers and society to phase out the use of them, the whole class, as quickly as possible, right? And then what my job is, well, I was part of that group, but my job is to translate that into action. And so what we did was start with, where can we like insert this idea in like precedent setting ways to where we can expand it out later, right? So where's the easiest avenue to push forward first? And what we found was that one, in the market, it can be very powerful to apply pressure to companies that care about what people think. And then also at state and like very progressive state arenas, right? So what we decided was, can we convince, say, all the manufacturers of carpets and rugs that being associated with PFAS is bad for business? But at the same time, can we convince large companies who purchase carpets and rugs that it's also bad to do so, and they want to protect the environment and protect their workers, and can we at the same time work through state agencies to or state legislatures to control, either regulate their use or ban their use in carpets and rugs. So you take this one kind of lower hanging fruit, as we like to call it, because there was a lot of data showing that like 40 to 50% of the children's exposure to PFAS is coming from crawling on rugs. So it's a pretty horrible use of PFAS that was concerning for children. And I think not very many people would say, yes, I still want stain resistance on my carpet, even though it's exposing my children to these chemicals. So it was a good, wasn't a lot of arguments to to say we need to keep PFAS on carpets. And so, but you notice we picked like 4 or 5 different ways in which to try and push who would be first to say, okay, let's not use PFAS in carpets and rugs. And so this is one success story where you could we decided to pick a product that made sense, and then we were able to get their use first, like Google and San Francisco Department of Environment and Kaiser Permanente all got together, big companies, and changed their procurement policy to say we don't want PFAS on our rugs. So we changed the market in and the commercial space, but then we had all of the residential market left. So then we worked on a campaign on Lowe's and Home Depot to convince them that it was a bad idea as well. So then they decided, okay, we will no longer sell carpets and rugs with PFAS on them. And then also at the state level, there's been a couple of bans of carpets and rugs, PFAS use in carpets and rugs as well. In California, an agency that has regulated it. So once you start to push all these levers, you start to see like dominoes can fall, and you can push more levers. And now we're kind of in the space where we've done that a bit, where we've done it with food packaging and carpets and rugs and textiles. Hopefully we have a bill to be signed soon in California, banning PFAS in textiles, all apparel, basically. Now we're getting to the space where it's like, okay, how do we expand it into the hard areas? And that's, federally, electronics, things that are a bit harder to move the market forward, but we've laid the foundation for the reason like that it's possible and the reason why we should do it. And then I'll just end with there's always defense, right? So it makes it sound like it just was, everything is a success. But there's always going to be pushback. And so to go back to like, how do you navigate special interests serving on expert panels? We have to navigate that for sure. One of the ways in which industry has pushed back on the class-based approach is to try and redefine the definition of PFAS, right? So that's a very technical thing, right? But at the same time, if you can carve out your space of chemistry, then you're safe, right? And so they go straight out the science this way, and we have to you have to recognize when science is being used or misused to interfere with positive policy making. So I think that's how do you combat that? Well, you work with groups of scientists to form consensus as much as possible, and you communicate that as best as you can. You communicate that. It's been very helpful to have that paper to go back to, to respond to, industry talking points, industry pressure, industry science, is to go back to the group of like trusted scientists that you have like laid that foundation for, and you like, remember these people, they don't agree with what you're hearing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. And congratulations on that effort too. What a heavy lift. Aaron, would you like to provide an example of how you've taken an idea and through advocacy made it a reality?
Sure. And I'll go ahead and put our organization link in the chat as well. One of the, as I was listening to Dr. Reed, one of the, I noticed a lot of commonalities there, like 2 in particular. One is the element of an adoption curve in terms of like where you focus in terms of like looking at the lower hanging fruit and then going to the tougher stuff after that. And then the other part is the defense as well. So you can't celebrate too heavily too quickly because you have competing interests that maybe aren't so happy about your victory. So the way we work on this is through chapters that we have in cities and states. Those chapters then can either work directly on an initiative or they help us to identify other partners. And we look at a few things in terms of figuring out where to go. One is like ballot issues are very expensive. Takes a lot of money to gather the signatures alone, then let alone just like running the campaign after that. So it's a combination of funding being available, having the right people on the ground, and then also the likelihood that it will pass as well. So there's a large polling element that goes along with this. In fact, we hired a director of research, Dr. Pfas, and what she did is she used some elements from consumer marketing, something called a conjoint analysis, to be able to look at ways of framing an initiative and taking that design and then applying it to every ballot initiative state in the country, to be able to figure out, well, what are the areas that we have viability if we were to run a measure. And one of the challenges that we had with this is, like, again, like we started looking at this voting method. Well, we looked at this agnostically in terms of which voting method to push for. And then after doing this research, we saw that approval voting was very good in terms of simplicity, and then also leading in terms of winners, doing a good job at winner selection, as well as accurately capturing candidate support. The challenge with this approach was this voting method wasn't used in government anywhere. And so we had to show proof of concept, replication, and scaling in doing that. For an area that, like, isn't talked about a whole lot. It can be confusing for some folks, and also has some people who don't want any kind of change at all. That is, folks who are already elected. And so the way that we dealt with that was first looking at smaller cities, and then building from there. So we started in Fargo, North Dakota. That initiative passed by 63%. Then St. Louis, Missouri. So Fargo is like 120,000 people. St. Louis, Missouri is 300,000 people. St. Louis had passed by 68%. Then the council tried to repeal it. Then we passed another initiative with a local group that made it hard for them to repeal it. And now they really are not going to be able to repeal it at the council level. And then now we're working in Seattle, Washington, which is 750,000 people, again, with that kind of scaling idea. And then using this potential win to transition into states. And then looking at the state level, you affect not only all the local elections, but now you're talking about federal elections, US House, US Senate, even presidential elections, including the primary within the respective parties, as well as how electoral votes are assigned within that state. And then you have to make sure that there's infrastructure there left over, so that when inevitable competing interests come along, that there's someone there to defend it locally.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for walking us through that. I absolutely cherish the fact that all three of our panelists are approaching science and technology policy and policy making, mechanisms from such different perspectives. Again, there's some, common threads, starting locally, right? Starting with a small group and incrementally building up to a point where it's undeniable and much more difficult to push back on. Also recognizing that, our high school textbook understanding of policymaking is not what the real world looks like. We are not electing people who, like a scientist or engineer, is taking a broad landscape understanding of every given issue. In reality, they are being barraged by information at all times from stakeholders who have the capacity to bring their attention to particular issues. And more often, it's the corporations, individuals, families, and communities with historic and current wealth that are bringing those issues to the forefront. So I'm absolutely inspired by these three examples. We have just about 10 more minutes left in the panel, so I definitely want to make sure that we are addressing the three questions from our audience. Thank you so much to Jessica Ponder, Dr. Diane Bushman, and Chloe Lind for contributing. And Anna, you mentioned in your example, how to deal with industry. Jessica asked, how do you start to make progress when decision makers allow commercial interests to lead what's called, expert groups, right? And I think we've especially seen in the last 5.5 years in particular in the United States, right, a redefining, an attempt to redefine what an expert is. And Jane, I think you are taking the tack of trying to expand what expert means also, right? To recognize people with lived experience are experts in their own experiences. So if the three of you can touch on, in addition to Jessica's question about, just dealing with industry in particular beyond what Anna so wonderfully provided, how you navigate this ever shifting definition of expert.
And it's actually probably might go towards definitely the first question. Well, yes, the first question. I think what Anna was saying about, if you're a scientist and you're seeing, your science being used in irresponsible, potentially nefarious ways, right? And you note that, there are other folks via their research who also see, the bad possibilities. One route definitely is to, gain a consensus among scientists, right? That you can definitely go ahead and organize that. And I think that's one common element, and actually one good way of like trying to neutralize some of this here, right? Is organizing that. And one thing that I really pulled out from Anna's story was that, they made a report. And so in my work, when it comes to like narrative, right, reports are like one good way of like seeding a narrative, right? That, we have a data-driven narrative that shows that, this chemical or compound may have, bad repercussions for society, right? It may have some good benefits for a product, but the benefits, might not outweigh the cons. And that's one like narrative project that you can employ. But you can do other kind of things too. Thanks. There you go. Right? There are many other ways that you can also engage the public. You can engage other folks within your field to talk about this. So reports, you could also have various convenings, conferences, talks, panels. You also can move beyond your sector and just go out and talk to everyday people who may be interfacing with these compounds, don't know what a Pfas is, for example, but definitely know something is up, but don't know what it is. And you can talk to them, you can do community-based works, right? And that those things, as you are connecting folks back to, let's say, a report, right? That's what it spells out all the science consensus around a topic, it can help folks within those communities to then ask folks who are convening these, expert panels, these politicians convening these panels, hey, number one, why aren't these scientists on this panel? But also number two, what this expert panel is saying is going against all these scientists who already have quote unquote consensus. It doesn't make sense, right? And so also it's important for scientists to think about public opinion and winning over the public to why this is an important issue and the way they can get involved. There are many, many groups thinking about like the environment that have done a very great job of engaging folks, whether it be the Sierra Club, Wikipedia.org, NRDC, right, of engaging like folks in communities to also, steward some of the science, right? It doesn't just have to be scientists, promoting data-driven policy, right? It also can be everyday people. And so one way you can start to actually combat this is to engage the public, because you should know that, companies are also doing the same thing, right? And so if you're not there talking to everyday people, know that the companies they're giving money to like baseball teams and great swag, but not always the science that is important to helping folks, guard their public health. So, reach out and like share your science beyond, just our journals and beyond just our panels to folks who might not have science backgrounds too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to combine the second two questions about strategies that you might employ to navigate different sides and personalities to get your message across, particularly when you know that there are forces pushing back. And I think you've each touched on various elements of these of both of these questions, but in our final 5 minutes here, if one or multiple of you would like to add to that, right? The deliberate strategies that you need to embed in your process to anticipate all of that. Aaron, or yes, please.
Sure. So, and in some cases, it's difficult to persuade a certain segment, particularly when they have a conflict of interest. And like with us, like we're a nonprofit and we have limited resources. And so sometimes you just have to also kind of like make the calculations, like, is the support high enough there? And if it is, maybe focus on that group and this other segment that may be even more resilient if you try to persuade them further. Maybe just kind of focus where the support likely is. And I mean, there are inevitably conflicts. For example, like in the case of St. Louis, we worked there with the local group to not only change their election to be able to pick all the candidates that they like, but also to an open primary. So there was like a top two where you could pick all you like in the open primary, and then you have this this runoff. And like a lot of major cities, like this one was heavily Democratic party, and so the council itself was pushing to oppose the ballot initiative measure. And interestingly, one of the independents on the council said, well, like, do you think it's appropriate for us as an independent governing body to oppose this measure where we have this kind of obvious conflict of interest? And we're saying that the party, the Democratic Party, loses some power here. It's like, I don't know that this is appropriate. Like, what do you all think? And then the chair of the council said, well, it's true, so I'm voting for it. And they passed it. I mean, they passed this opposition resolution, but it didn't matter. Like the initiative passed by 68% anyway. So sometimes you just have to recognize that some folks are going to have this conflict and they're going to do what they're going to do. And you have to kind of focus your energy where it matters.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up. Although Dr. Reed, I see that you've just unmuted, so would love for your brief comments as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, I think that the last few years have really taught us the importance of addressing conflict of interest like directly. And there's been a lot of scientists that were put in place in that just came out of like the industry that they're supposed to be regulating. And so I think, fully addressing conflict of interest directly and not giving, benefit of the doubt. There's plenty of people can work on a problem and doesn't need to be the people that are being regulated is important. And then I would say, definitely there are times where there's going to be people that are, as Aaron said, just not going to be supportive. But I think that just to add to that, there are I would always look for interesting partnerships that to build support for something, like things that areas that you don't think that you would necessarily see a lot of alignment. You can find commonality in a lot of situations. I would say like we had really great partnerships with firefighters because firefighters were being exposed to these chemicals, and it brought to the table like a lot of Republicans that would normally not talk to us. We've had really good partnerships with like water providers because they don't want to, they're stuck with a problem they can't handle. And so bringing in people that that you normally wouldn't work with and building an alliance really, really helps with that situation.
Yeah, thank you so much. That coalition building, recognizing that we need each other. Thank you so much for keeping it brief. I appreciate, I want to acknowledge the panel one more time. Aaron Hamlin, Anna Reed, Jana Emma Mante, it has been an absolute privilege to bring you together today and to interact with our wonderful audience. I also wanted to acknowledge the efforts of our two Journal of Science Policy and Governance ambassadors, graduate student ambassadors, Nabila Riaz and Bipin Kumar, for their wonderful assistance on the JSPG Events and Programs Committee. So to our audience, as we wrap up in the next 15 seconds, I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that our deadline is November 6th for the winter issue, and we would love to have a wide variety of submissions. And for future events, please do look at our website. There are two more post-submission events in this series to engage more with the authors and our experts. So with that, I'd like to just thank everyone once again for showing up and doing what you do. Thank you again to our panelists. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon and day, everyone. Thank you. All right, bye-bye.